So here we go. Uh, I'm delighted to be here. I'm going to speak for about 30 minutes, just so to set your expectations. And then I'm happy to engage in conversation, listen to your comments. Uh, I've been a member of CACOR for a long time, and I'm delighted that we're learning to use Zoom because it has the promise of helping CACOR become much more of a national organization. Since I moved from Ottawa 31 years ago, it's awkward to participate. So this is great. I want to thank you all, particularly those of you in Ottawa, for doing this. I want to share a new concept, civilizational overshoot. It's a concept I developed a couple of years ago for a speech in San Francisco, and then Bill Reese and I assume many of you know his work, some of you may know him personally, extraordinary evolutionary scientist out in UBC. He and I did a session at the recent AAAS annual meeting in Seattle under the heading of Will Modern Civilization Be the Death of Us? And we argued that it will. This is one of Bill's slides. You may know that he is the father of the concept of the human footprint. And he has argued for a long time that we're in ecological overshoot. And he and I now argue that we're also in civilizational overshoot. And what's more, if we're actually going to deal with ecological overshoot, we have to understand and deal with civilizational overshoot. So that's the logic of the two of them. So we'll turn to Wittgenstein, a philosopher in Vienna, who was once asked, "What is your aim in philosophy?" And he said somewhat enigmatically, "To show the fly the way out of the fly bottle." You can see a fly bottle there on the right-hand side. What you can't see from this angle is that the bottom of that top bottle is actually cut out. And there's sugar water placed in the bottom bottle. And flies have developed evolutionarily enough that they can sense where there's food some distance away from the food. So they pick up that signal, fly down in through the top bottle, through the narrow neck, into the bottom bottle, and they can fly around and think there's food and it's great. Except, of course, they can't get out. Fly bottles are fly traps, and the flies are meant to die. So you can see where I'm going with this, that the view of civilizational overshoot suggests that we in modern techno-industrial cultures, that our form of civilization, we are now living like the fly. That is, we can get into situations that are so complex that we ourselves can't understand them. And therefore, we're on a path to death. The difference between us and the flies is that in principle, we have enough reflexivity, we can in principle understand this. And the question is, well, what do we have to do that? And one of the answers is understand civilizational overshoot, because this is not something that we understand now. It's not yet an established concept in the literature, and so we're at risk. And so the question I ask is, how do we overcome the blindness? MTI stands for Modern Techno-Industrial. That's us, that's who we are in our culture, the OECD world broadly. And as Louise Penny said in her second last book, nothing good ever came out of a blind spot. And we know that. We know that when we're blindsided, that is when we're hit by something that traumatizes us and we're not expecting it, that it's far deeper trauma than if we mishandle something we see coming and that we're expecting. And all you have to do is think about the trauma in the United States from 9/11 and the fact that there has been no leader since that time, not at the time and not since, that have helped the Americans process this in a way that it's helped deal with their trauma. And so since 9/11, the trauma in America from 9/11 has got deeper and deeper and deeper, and they're increasingly neurotic. And this is not good for them, it's not good for us. So Einstein said, well, one of the ways to see better if we are blind to something is to go to a higher level of generality, because you can't solve problems at the same level. That quote from Einstein is well known by now. And Bill and I apply this to our form of civilization. That is, that we in modern techno-industrial cultures cannot deal with the problems we've got ourselves into without, in fact, moving to a new level of generality. And so here, 3 levels. You can think of subcultures, which you can understand within a subculture, but you can see them more clearly if you look from the point of view of the whole culture and how the subculture fits in the culture. And in the same way, you can see our culture more clearly if you move to a higher level of generality, namely the form of civilization. So the important point here is simply that the language of a higher level of, at least the form of civilization, is a higher level of generality. And so the 2 critical concepts are culture and form of civilization. The most common use of culture, if you say it to most people in our culture, they think of arts and culture. So that's that little c in the blue space. But we also use culture that's equivalent to the whole of the blue space. That in lots of sentences and lots of times, people talk about culture as if it's the whole of society. And so the triple bottom line is often talked about environment, the economy, and culture. And of course, if you're an environmentalist, you draw the diagram that way. The way Bill and I use it, we mean it this way. We're both constructivists when it comes to our ontology and epistemology. That is, as human beings, we create the worlds we live by as social constructions. And so even the environment is for us a social construction in the modern world. In other words, if you think of the environment in a modern way, it means very different things than it would, for example, to Leroy Little Bear, who's a Blackfoot elder in the Blood Reserve in southern Alberta. And Leroy can talk knowingly about both Blackfoot metaphysics and modern metaphysics and how they're different. And he will tell you that what Blackfeet mean by the environment is not at all what we mean. And even in my lifetime, when I was a child, there was no environment. There was indoors and there was outdoors. The environment is something we've literally co-created in modern culture in my lifetime. And that makes the point that I'm making. Northrop Frye, the great Canadian literary critic, understood that cultures make sense for us and of us. We're all born into a culture that makes sense of the world. We absorb that. And as Frye points out, whatever a culture produces, whatever, is a symbol of that culture. He understood it as a system. And Stafford Beer, some of you in Ottawa will remember him from when he lived in Toronto and used to come to Ottawa. I have great memories of lying on Kathy Starr's living room floor with him. We were all children of the 60s in then Pierre Trudeau's early 70s. And of course, he points out that cultures are systems and that the kind of problems we identify and think they're just mistakes we can fix are actually outputs. And we know from other work that cultures are path dependent, that once you're formed in a culture, the inclination for both persons and the culture is to keep that culture going. If you don't believe that, look at the behavior of those of us in Alberta who are now path dependent on oil and gas. And by God, would rather destroy Canada than change our path. So that every culture makes an unconscious bet that the way it construes reality actually has an adequate grasp on reality and what it takes as knowledge that can be trusted with one's life. And yet we know that whole cultures can live by mythic systems that get it wrong enough for the culture to go into ecological and cultural overshoot. And when they do, they collapse. And what Bill and I are doing is upping the ante by saying it's not just ecological and cultural overshoot, as if the American culture can collapse, that Canadians will be fine, but rather the whole form of our modern techno-industrial civilization is at risk. So let's think then about the different uses of civilization. It's what philosophers do of add subscripts to different senses of the word so we can distinguish them and not be confused. And the ones in yellow are the subscripts, the uses of civilization that we deem to be acceptable. So civilization G is global, as in the sentence, civilization is now at risk. That means the whole of humanity, perfectly good sentence, and it's a legitimate use of the word civilization. Civilization O is the original term. As you may know, it emerged in the 1700s in France, drawing on the Latin, that it meant people who were civilized were the people who lived in towns, which meant that our indigenous cousins were uncivilized. And of course, the Europeans that came from Europe to Canada and met indigenous people here treated them that way. And by and large, that is deep in our psyche even now. And what we're saying is that that use of civilization has to be struck from our mouths. If you use it that way, wash your mouth out with soap. We don't pay attention to the 17th century views of women or of people with dark skins. Why should we pay any attention to the use of the language of civilization? But there's also the language, subscript P, that means geography. So the talk of Eastern or Western civilization is very common, as if in fact these are well-formed concepts, but they're not. There's nothing in the Earth's atmosphere that means that geographically there's something about living east of Iran maybe that makes you think one way and west of it in another. Because if you actually understand what people mean by Eastern imagination, you will find that it maps onto most indigenous ways of thinking. It also maps on to the ancient Hebrews' way of thinking, which are part of the so-called Western world. So that's just confused stuff that emerged in the 17th and 18th centuries as we, as people, were beginning to discover other people were around. And as we think more clearly, we can leave it behind. And finally, there's a use of culture that is very common, that applies, there's a use of civilization that's common. And what it essentially does is it's equal to the integral use, the holistic use of culture that Bill and I and others are using. So that to talk of Chinese culture, to talk of Chinese civilization, there's no difference cognitively in what you mean by it if you're talking in a holistic sense of culture. Rather, it's just an honorific that means that for cultures that are kind of big and long-lasting and impressive, we call them civilizations, or if they're old enough. So we talk of ancient Greek civilization. Nobody talks of Icelandic civilization. So it's just an honorific, and it has no cognitive content. So if we get rid of it, then it helps us think more clearly. So this form, the language of civilization that I'm thinking about today means form of civilization. It's always indicated by subscript F. So indigenous people are a form of civilization. In other words, whether you're indigenous, whatever part of the world and whatever time of history, what we're saying is that however dramatically different those indigenous cultures are, they're still more like each other than any of them are like modern cultures. This is not good, bad. We're just phenomenologically looking at it. So that a form of civilization is a shared human way of knowing, experience, and being in reality and being human. The core paradigm of which is fundamentally different from the core paradigm of a different form of civilization. So that I draw your attention to the diagrams. The one on the left is just kind of a blank form of civilization. And the thing that's important about it is that big, thick gray line that is around it. And what you see there is that a form of civilization can actually be defined cognitively and emotionally and spiritually and distinguished from other forms of civilization. So it's not just a vague notion. And what you see in the middle is a form of civilization that makes the point that there can be very different cultures in it, but those cultures are more like each other than they're like cultures in other forms of civilization. So on the right-hand side, there's a second form of civilization. In this case, it's not totally different from the one in the middle. They're both blue. One's blue-yellow, the other's blue-green. But the point is that the folks in the right-hand form of civilization their cultures, while different from each other, are still more like each other than any of them are like the cultures in the middle. And I can use an example that is true. Some of the folks from the Stony Dakota, who are my neighbors, went to what we think of as Siberia in eastern Russia and visited their indigenous people. This is 12 or so years ago. And the interesting thing is, when they came back, they told us that they felt they were at a family reunion. These are people that they'd never met before. But they realized that these people were more like them than any of the people who live in Lac des Arcs or in Canmore, who are their modern neighbors. And this is not a statement about whether they like us or not, or whether we care for and love each other. It's a statement of just culturally, they fit together in a way that was extraordinary. And the core paradigm of form of civilization has to do with the way that the folks in the cultures of that civilization know, imagine, think things through, and conduct themselves regarding, and these are the three core elements: the nature of reality, the nature and power of human persons, and the relationship of persons to reality. In other words, if you understand the ontological and epistemological assumptions, that the cognitive content that goes into those three things, if they're different enough, you may be dealing with a different form of civilization and not just a different culture. So that this suggests that culture shock, if you've gone from Canada for the first time, if you're those of us who are at all my age, we remember culture shock when we were very young, when we first left Canada to go to other countries. But they tended to be countries in what we think of now as the modern world. And yes, there was culture shock, but it was nothing like the culture shock that we got when we went, for example, when Heather and I went and lived in India 50 some years ago. That there was something about that, not judging it in a good, bad way, but simply phenomenologically, these people in significant ways lived in a different understanding of reality and what persons were and how you relate to that. Which means then that each form of civilization holds the possibility of actually doing the human as living beings on the earth in different ways. Which means then that the trajectory of history changes when a new form of civilization emerges, because what up to then has been an adjacent possible, in Stuart Kaufman's terms, now becomes an actual, not just a potential. And you can see that in the way that cultural anthropologists actually talk about our actual history. That 200 or 300 years ago, each one of these colors are major forms of civilization: yellow, green, red. And we know that as we descended from our great ape ancestors and became Homo sapiens 200 or 300,000 years ago, we all lived in small group nomadic cultures for 95% of the time we've been Homo sapiens. And up until the Holocene, 10 or 12,000 years ago, as the earth began to warm, some of those people, only some of them, so the words in blue matter, a process began that was optional and unconscious over very long time periods, centuries and even millennia, in local and regional places, that some of the folks who had lived in small group nomadic cultures began to learn to live in local settled agriculture-based cultures. And by the time that model was really clarified and crystallized, they didn't even recognize their cousins in nomadic cultures as cousins. And we're back to they're uncivilized. And then eventually, about 5,000 or 6,000 years ago, regional agriculture-based empires emerged. China, Rome, Egypt, the Mayans. And then in the last 1,000 years, we've been developing our modern techno-industrial way of being in our own skins, being in the earth, experiencing ourselves and reality. And then far more recently, there have been a couple of modern empires, the British and the Americans were the only ones very good at it. And even the British lasted 100 years, and Donald Trump is doing what he can to make sure the American empire isn't longer than 100 years. And this is the fantasy that's part of the modern techno-industrial myth. This is not globalization as phenomenon. As phenomenon, we've been discovering over a very long time that other people live in different parts of the world, although we haven't found anybody we didn't know was there for over 30 years. So that, I mean, right today, we could give all 7.5 billion of us GPS coordinates and locate us all on the planet. But as project, as a cultural and civilizational project, globalization has been to take modernity and the market economy to the ends of the earth. And the fantasy is that that's development. We got really committed to it after the Second World War in development projects. And even sustainable development was an extension of that same development, although we kidded ourselves that sustainable development was really different. And now the UN Sustainable Development Goals are both sustainable and development goals, and they fit, they're just an extension of modernity. And they'll all become like us. And what's more, they'll all be better for it. And in 1989, Fukuyama blurted out in his silly little book that we were the end of history, that the rest of history is in fact what most citizens in modern cultures ask their governments for, and that is to continue modernity forever and ever, just improve it and make it better. And so they support innovation, they support enterprise, they support entrepreneurship, they support creativity, as long as it gives them a better version of the modern world. So the normality that people want to go back to after COVID is that world. And the question is, can it happen? So civilizational overshoot, I can now define it, having set that up, that what we mean is civilizational overshoot occurs when the core paradigm of the presuppositions of a whole form of civilization no longer enable the people or cultures in that exemplify that form of civilization to make reliable sense of, much less enable them to cope with the existing and emerging realities and challenges which characterize their time. In short, if your form of civilization collapses, it means no culture of that form has a long-term future. And if you think of indigenous forms of civilization, it's reasonably clear and a pretty good bet, because it's already 200,000 to 300,000 years old, that it's robust and resilient enough that that won't happen. But if you look at our modern form of civilization, which is the most recent, you don't have, there's a ton of data that is suggesting we are like the flies in the fly bottle, and we're just having trouble coming to terms with it. That we've created complex, messy situations that we don't even understand. And what's more, we don't yet have the humility to say we don't understand it. So most of the people doing sustainability stuff are fighting with each other as to which of their solutions is best. That is, they won't even talk about the possibility in a serious way that our modern techno-industrial form of civilization is an overshoot and facing collapse. And so Bill's reasoning is important here. The fundamental conclusion is that we have to transcend our modern techno-modernism and catalyze a personal to civilizational change. That's change at every level, from deeply personal to civilizational, into ways of being in the earth in which we live spiritually satisfying lives more equitably within the means of nature. Unless you think that Bill is peddling 19th century religion, what he's saying by spiritually satisfying lives is that the world has to be meaningful for us enough that there's an intrinsic basis, not an extrinsic basis. There has to be an internal basis for self-restraint, because without self-restraint, it's clear that we moderns destroy the world. And the irony is that modernity rejoices in the fact that modern freedom means you don't need to be self-restrained. You're only restrained by other people. And therefore, unwittingly, this is not a deliberate plot. We're destroying the biosphere. But as Bill points out in a constructivist way, the means in which we apprehend reality determines the reality we apprehend. And as I've tried to point out, our way of apprehending reality doesn't get reality. Now, this is an extraordinary thing to say, particularly at a meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, because at the core of our modern way of apprehending reality is First Enlightenment science. And the myth is that before First Enlightenment science, there was ignorance and mythology, and now with science, we have objectivity and the truth, and we'll go on forever. And what Bill and I are saying is, sadly, that is not true. That First Enlightenment understandings of the world do not get reality. And what's more, we don't get the fact we don't get reality. And so we're not investing in trying to move beyond it, which puts us in both ecological and civilizational overshoot. So we don't know in modern cultures that we have no long-term future. Yes, there are individuals who know it. There are even some organizations who know it, but there isn't a politician in the world. There isn't a president of a bank. There isn't a deputy minister. There isn't even, at this point, many Anglican archbishops who would take that seriously. University presidents, you have to hunt long and hard to find them. So we need a new culture that is beyond our modern techno-industrial way of being. And what's more, that new culture has to exemplify a new form of civilization. And that's the hard part. And if you think I'm just talking through my hat, here's a Canadian example. This diagram, some of you may have seen, it's from a Horizons Canada report done for SSHRC. And as you know, SSHRC funds the humanities and social sciences in our universities. And about 3 years ago, SSHRC said to Horizons Canada, which is the in-house foresight group of the federal government, would you identify for us the major challenges, the grand challenges of the 21st century that we in Canada and the rest of the world have to cope with? And SSHRC, Horizons Canada did an 18-month project, and this is the diagram of that they're in their report. The report's on the Horizons Canada website. You can download it. And what they're saying is that in these 16 spaces, or in some combination of them, in other words, some grand challenges may need things from more than one of these spaces, but in these 16 spaces or combinations thereof, all of the major challenges that the government of Canada and Canadians will face are here. And if we should look at that and say, well, on reflection, we think you're missing something, they would point to that dotted box in the bottom left-hand corner and say, well, if there's a 17th, tell us what it is. We don't think we've missed it, but tell us. We're open-minded. And if we say, no, that's not really what we mean. What we mean is that this way of grasping reality, this way of thinking that you can take reality and its challenges and divide it up into 16 tidy silos, because if you look at that as an image, just as an abstract image, it looks like a classroom in the old days where the desks were screwed to the floor and faced the front, and the teacher is, as you know, at the front of the room. It looks like an org chart. It looks like an aerial view of downtown Calgary where the streets run north and south and the avenues run east and west. But what isn't seen here is that the need to transcend modernity and mature into the next form of civilization did not even occur to them. It's not even on their map as a candidate to think about. And tragically, this idea is not on the list of any 21st century grand challenges. And you may know that the language of grand challenges emerged in the European Commission about 15 years ago. There's now dozens of them around the world, from church groups to the AAAS to governments, and none of them have this on their list. This is the group at Cambridge. There are now a dozen of these kind of groups around the world dedicated to the study and mitigation of the risks that could lead to human extinction or civilizational collapse, and none of them have modernity on the list as a possibility to even think about. Now, if I'm wrong, we can all sleep well at night. But if there's anything into what Bill and I are saying, then we are in way more trouble than we know. And there's an irony here, as well as a profound threat. that our MTI efforts to save the future now use and utterly trust and depend on the fitness of the very ways of knowing, being, and living that got us into this complex living messes that now threaten our future. That is, our modern techno-industrial ways of knowing, seeing, thinking, and living are the deepest source of our troubles. And as of today, we who are MTI people are not seeking to transcend or escape from, that should be from, the modern form of civilization. That's simply not on our agendas. Rather, we're seeking to improve and extend the way of life of our MTI cultures by making them to be global, equitable, and sustainable. And that's what, folks, that's what the SDGs are about. It's what most people who are talking about what we can learn from COVID are talking. I don't despise being kinder and caring for one another. But if we don't understand the deepest threat that will kill us, then the best that may happen is that we're holding hands in friendship, all good, as we die. And so the core work of the 21st century is this. It's not to improve and make modernity sustainable. It's not what we think it is. Rather, it's to learn to know, imagine, think through, and respond to the actual situation that we're in. And that's a situation of ecological and civilizational overshoot, which means that we need to let go of and outgrow our MTI identities at every scale. This means as men, as women, as religions, as universities, as corporations, as business, as governments, as deputy ministers. It means that all of the ways of knowing, imagining, thinking things through, and responding are at least candidates to say we need to think about that, and we need to think about it in a holistic way. It's a fantasy to think we can imagine a new economy without thinking about what this does for our spirituality and psychology, except that's the way we're going about it, so that even the things, the projects we hold up as transformative are more deeply modern than they know. So we need to commit to the new work of consciously co-creating the next form of human civilization by nurturing into resilient being, consciously co-creative persons and cultures. So in a sense, the blunt choice is to extend modernity or transcend it. Now, transcend, this isn't a value judgment in the simple-minded sense of good, bad, because to transcend means to build on. So we're taking modernity as given fact and giving thanks for it and building on it, but moving beyond it, which means that one of the things we need is our public wakes for the industrial age. We need to gather in places like our football stadiums, 50,000 at a time, and grieve the passing of modernity. And as at a good wake, we will celebrate its gifts, and we will state and probably overstate the quality of them, but it's what you do at a wake as you mourn and grieve the passing of something you have loved and lived by. But you also let it go. And on the right-hand side, you see that a process that in history up to now has been optional, unconscious, over very long periods of time, and local, regional, is now required of us as a conscious exercise, rapid by any historical standard. And ultimately, it doesn't mean we have to do it all at once, but it has to be scalable to all of us on the planet. And the view of Foresight Canada is that this hypothesis is worth investing in, developing, and testing. And then you rinse and repeat. Having invested in it, developed it to some extent, and tested it, you find that it's incomplete, and so you invest further, develop further, and test further, and it turns out that that may go on forever. Over to you. The future is in our hands, hearts, minds, heads, and spirits. We are co-creating our future, whether we like it or not. And our view is that we should be co-creating a future that we are far more deeply conscious of and far more honest about the situation we're in, but that in fact, there is a way out of the fly bottle. It may be a thin thread, but there is a way out. And if we don't know that, then we will be more depressed and hopeless than in fact is needed. And that would just add to the tragedy. Thank you.
Oh,
Okay, I've unmuted everyone, or at least most people. And we have at least, well, there's two questions that I can ask the people to talk to. And then, of course, David, you are talking about, it seems to me that this cultural construction means that the corruption we often see as an output that we tacitly accept. Do you want to talk to that?
Yeah, I can try. My impression at the time was that essentially Ruben is saying whatever we're getting out of our system is what we've designed to get out of our system. And if in fact our system is producing corruption, it must be because we've designed it that way. We get Trump because we designed it to get Trump.
yes, exactly.
So there's something pretty wrong about that system.
Can I ask a question?
Well, let me just quickly respond to that. Rather than the language of design, I would talk about the system has evolved that way. And yes, we have, if we are co-creators, whether we like it or not, our fingerprints are all over it. But no human culture has been conscious enough yet of co-creators to sit back and design a culture. I'm not suggesting we can do that now, which is where design theory assumes a culture. You can't sit back and design a whole culture starting from scratch. But it can evolve, and you can co-evolve with it. But you have to learn to pay. So yes, the outputs that we got from Donald Trump, but including to the fact that the economic chain that we depended on to put goods together, the supply chain we depended on, turned out to be so fragile as a global supply chain that one virus could take it down. That's all part of the way modernity has evolved, including the fact that we have this technology. In other words, it's not in any sense saying modernity bad, this other is good, but it is saying it's all ours, folks. We got to learn to own it all. And we have to learn to ask whether we can fix it enough as our modern faith tells us, or whether we have to learn to let it go and move on.
So then I sense that what you're saying is that we often get unintended consequences. We have to watch for these consequences and we have to correct them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I want to say that at the heart of modern models are mechanical models. And by definition, mechanical models only have unintended consequences if you're ignorant. Whereas what we're learning is that we're part of living complex systems, and living complex systems have unintended consequences simply because of their nature. In other words, it's an illusion to think you can become smart enough to identify and avoid. It's a modern illusion to think that if you get the right people together, we can design a system with no unintended consequences. I'm sorry, as living complex creatures, we're stuck with unintended consequences. You bloody well better allow for them, because they're going to surprise the hell out of you. Sometimes with joy, other times with fear.
Okay, we have through the chat, we have an urgent kick in here from John Legg. John, do you want to talk to your point?
It's not particularly urgent, but it fits in, Ruben, with your very large view. I spent 31 years with Foreign Affairs, and I make no apology for the fact that I was a cold warrior. Went to military college and then dealt with the USSR, etc., etc. But I will never forget my first posting with Martin Collicott, who went on to be Canada's ambassador 3 times. He said to me, and I've never forgotten it, I think maybe you might wish to get a hold of a very wise Chinese person and see whether you might get anything additionally out of him to add to your view. And the reason is that, according to my good friend Martin, there are two words in Mandarin which mean the same thing. The first is foreigner. The second is barbarian. And that says a lot because that came from the Middle Kingdom, China. And so that's my only point. I appreciated very much your presentation, but when you're dealing with a civilization such as the Chinese civilization and you're up against those thoughts, I would say beware and sharpen your cold warrior skills. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Extraordinary example that, from my point of view, maps on to the space I've been trying to talk about. What I want is the same sensitivity to bring to us in a self-reflexive way. We could see in your example, or you could see the way that Chinese culture, in a sense, is trapped in a particular mythology of its own making.
Yes.
And the thought that is not yet acceptable in modern culture is that we too are trapped in a mythology of our own making.
Good point.
Okay, our next question comes from Bill Tyson. Bill, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, the name Reese strikes a bell. Is he the chap who invented the idea of the human footprint?
I'm sorry?
Is Reese the professor who invented the idea of the footprint?
Yes, yes, that's the
Which in the modern world has a certain impact on the environment. I don't see anything wrong with modern technology. I like to fly. I like to visit other parts of the world, and I like all of the conveniences it gives, like the ability to participate in this call. But what we have, there's too many people on the planet, and they're simply ruining it. So what we've got to do is not address the civilization or the technology. We've got to somehow control the human biological urge to reproduce. End of message.
Bill, I accept that that is one way to construe reality. It's within a modern way. It's one of the moves modernity makes to defend modernity. Perfectly understandable, perfectly normal. Whether as persons or cultures, when our ego is attacked, we defend it. Me too. And this is a modern move that does that. The question, the data is not in yet. Now, by the time we can tell which of us is more accurate, it may be too late, whether by your story or mine.
My story is just that you have too many people on the planet.
I know, I get your story. It fits a huge number of facts. The question is it a good enough hypothesis to fit enough facts, and is it coherent enough to be trusted? That's the only issue I'm raising.
Okay, our next comment is from Ted Manning. Ted, go ahead.
Hi, Ruben. That was fun. But I'm going to quibble a little bit, maybe because I just don't understand on what are the defining attributes of MTI. You know, is it just growth? And therefore, I'm thinking of it as a sort of a limits to growth issue. Or is it a broader set of assumptions that our particular culture seems to accept? And are any of them, in fact, negotiable? And if it is just growth, then growth in what? And can it, in fact, be growth in acceptable and satisfying lifestyles rather than just accumulation of goods?
Wonderful question. And I absolutely acknowledge I did not define in a clear way what how I define modernity, or therefore the culture's forms of civilization before it or after. That would be a different talk that takes longer, but it won't surprise you that it's at very deep levels.
Mhm.
It's the modern assumptions about the nature of reality.
Mhm.
Remember, the first Enlightenment basically said there's two bits of reality. There's things that are objective, that are external to us as human beings, and we are subjects so there's subjects and objects in the world. An objective knowledge of the world we can have, but that objective knowledge is totally impersonal and objective. So even when we look at ourselves as subjects, we look objectively. And what is now breaking down, for example, is that the cutting edge of science can't be shoehorned into First Enlightenment science. You can't do epigenetics in a First Enlightenment way.
Oh, come on. The only real source of reality these days is Fox News.
And Fox News, in a funny way, makes the point that we're still avoiding, and that is that we have to learn to take responsibility for the way we construe reality. And that's not something, that's to grow up both personally, but it's also to grow up as a whole culture. And back to my example of Alberta, there isn't a ghost of a chance that the major figures and the population of Alberta are mature enough to take responsibility for the fact we have construed reality mistakenly, and the fact that we're dying as an economy is our responsibility, not somebody else's.
Okay, and our next one is Zach. Zach, do you want to go ahead?
Hi, it's on the screen if you're looking at it. Look, this reminds me of Thinking by Marshall McLuhan, and I'm sure you hope that's a compliment. I think it is. 4 new adjectives on your second or third last slide: required, conscious, and so forth, are the kinds of things we need to deal with climate change, which I've misspelled. But my problem, and I should add, it was a Nobel laureate who was giving lectures around the mid-1960s and 70s, introduced us all to the notion of evolutionary design rather than technological design. But we come back to my problem, which is practically, I never knew what to do with the speech by McLuhan. Any ideas?
Yes. I mean, at one level, the world needs a serious institute to probe into this hypothesis, and it would be an institute of both research and citizen engagement. At another level, at a very human level, what it turns out to be is each of us, I mean, our culture, our modern culture is, in fact, the way it's evolved, is biasing each of us to trust objective realities more than our own experience, which is why experts are so critical, and we keep talking about facts and science and experts, and if we only had enough of those, we'd be fine. So that you don't even trust your own experience. And the question I'm raising, if what we're doing is getting a fresh experience of the nature of reality, and to put it crassly, is are we going to trust First Enlightenment experts more than we trust our own experience of love and grace and forgiveness and beauty? And that's a very personal issue for each of us, as well as for our small groups that we trust. Do they reinforce? Which of those do they reinforce? And the view that Bill and I have come to is that if we keep trusting experts, we're actually, ironically, telling ourselves we're still deeply trapped in the modern story. And so the way out of this is that and this can, I mean, within the modern story, this feels like an overdose of German romanticism. So modernity can account for what I've just said, and they know where to file me, and they know it's not objective, and it's just romantic nonsense. And so why do we even give him airtime? I understand.
Okay, we move on, and John Meyer, you're next.
Yeah, I guess if you're talking about reconnecting with our reality, personal reality, I'd like to point to Art with his experience with renewable energy. He's involved in energy flows, real time. He understands energy flows. He knows where, in effect, his wealth is coming from, at least on the energy level. I don't think he probably has any more idea than the rest of us do in terms of our material goods, mostly due to Chinese coal and food systems. But so at least at one level, he's connected into the real-time energy flows, and all of us became disconnected. Our culture became disconnected when we got into fossil fuels, which is stored energy. If we had to deal with real-time energy flows the way past cultures have had to do, then we would be much more connected. And I just hold out Art as an example, who using technology to become completely aware of real-time energy, and at least on that one link connect back to develop, push culture in a way that connects to the real world. That wasn't really a question. I guess the question is, do you think that's a valid way of looking at it?
Bill and I would both agree that as a species, we have evolved, we have co-evolved with the planet, and we're subject to the second law of thermodynamics, and we're in trouble because of it, which is what the ecological footprint is about. And I mean, it's about both about energy and about renewable resources. So we can, within modernity, we can figure out that we're a fly in a fly trap and we need to get out. The question is, can modernity be the vehicle that lets us learn enough to get out? And Bill and I have come to the conclusion that it isn't, and that there are good reasons for that, that as far as modernity goes, it doesn't give us enough to get out. Thomas Homer Dixon will be publishing a new book he's been working on for 8 years about hope, because he has figured out that the critical question for us as a species is the question of hope, because the more we learn, just even within science as we know it, the more hopeless our situation looks. And therefore, he's taken 8 years to write a book. Haven't read it yet. But so the question you're raising, and he draws very much on, if you know his work, on the points you're making, John. But the question is that understanding sufficient, or do we need to widen up to pack other things into it? Do we need a more integrated understanding to even understand the predicament we're in, to have enough hope that we may, in fact, that there may be a future for our species and much that we love about this planet? I mean, the planet will be green. I think we know enough that this planet will be green for the next billion years, with or without us. There's not a ghost of a chance we can kill life.
Okay, fair enough. Thanks.
Okay, our next question then is from Susha Mann, followed by Mary and Marilyn.
Thank you. Very, very good, thought-provoking presentation. So the question coming in my mind is, are we becoming more conscious as we are growing older? Or for instance, us who are in 70s, 80s or plus, are we more conscious, or are our younger people more conscious to trust? Now, why I'm asking this is when I was growing up in 1950s, I felt my mother was more conscientious in how to manage the surrounding, the farm, and the household. And as we become more wealthy, I think we are screwing it up. So, and we are also becoming overpopulated as we are becoming wealthy, educated, and that is the case in most of the countries, in especially Asia, in China, India. And the only reason China's population was controlled because of regulation. It wasn't controlled because education or wealthy at that time. Maybe in the future it may go that way. So I have questions rather than solutions.
Wonderful, wonderful question. And I love your examples of your mother. The thing you said about her that I heard is that she was more conscientious. And if you're asking, I mean, so part of the question is, are we today more conscientious than our parents or grandparents? My answer to that would be no. That we have now $1 trillion advertising industry that they didn't have to cope with, that says it's all right not to be conscientious. Indulge yourself, you're worth it. And that business of indulging yourself is, that message is received multiple times a day in our culture. So we're less conscientious. The other question was, that's in my view, which is then a bit depressing because it may mean we're less skilled. And I would use as an example of that look at even 6 weeks of being in your own home has people clamoring to get out and get back to normal. So we can't experience 6 weeks without driving each other crazy for normalcy, let alone if we're into a 10-year depression as they were in the 30s, or a 5-year war as we were twice in the 20th century. About consciousness, my sense is that human consciousness is variable and the population is variable enough that some subsets of the population are far more conscious, that there is a degree and sophistication in some subsets of people that are far more conscious, so that humanistic psychology knows things about us as persons in a disciplined and even scientific way that were not known as carefully. But it's also the case that we have $1 trillion advertising industry. And therefore, if you look at downtown Calgary, I can tell you that I could have conversations in the Privy Council office in Ottawa, which is where I was in 1970, that were of a deeper quality than is evidence that any prime minister recently, going back to after Pierre Trudeau, after Joe Clark and Pierre Trudeau, that no prime minister of any has nurtured the quality of consciousness in the PMO that Trudeau did.
If I could just add,
Negative.
it would be nice, Ruben, if you could invite Jason Kenney to be a part of, as an honorable guest to one of our discussions.
My view of Jason Kenney is that he is as dangerous to Alberta, at least as dangerous to Alberta as Trump is to the world, and which is destructively dangerous. And what's more, he's more duplicitous. Trump at least has the integrity. He doesn't pretend to be other than what he is, whereas Kenney has an extraordinary capacity to present himself as other than he is. And he may not know who he is at some level. Those are psychological observations that none of us should make in a serious way about other people at a distance.
Okay, let's move on. That was very good, Ruben. I enjoyed that. Mary, you're next.
Hi, Ruben. So good to be with you again, many decades later.
In years.
But it's wonderful, as you say, that we're connecting this way. So it's a new beginning. Um, uh, when I put my name on the list to ask a question, my question was, is there a way out? Because that's how you finished your presentation. And yet you're starting to draw up a list in answering our questions to that question, I think. So I'm going to change my question slightly. What are the signs to us that we might be pursuing a way out?
Oh, wonderful question. At one point I had some slides attached. I could show one of them now, but let me just offer a couple of quotations. One is literally an almost random. It's one of the things I do with this way I look at the world, is I look for almost random examples in advertisements or other things that are helping make the point I'm trying to make. And so there's a quote I've got on a slide that comes from the Globe and Mail in March last year that's from a review of either a book or a play, and I can't even remember which. But the guy who's reviewing it ends up saying, this play or this book will actually cause you to be more reflective and to think about such things as I think about the system I live in, am I also thinking about the system that lives in me? Now, the way it connects is that the way out requires meta-reflexivity. We have to learn to be wise, integral, and meta-reflexive. Those are the three key words. I didn't put them on a slide. Wise means nothing that's important has been left out. You ask people over coffee what wise means, you get lots, but if you parse it down, it means a wise judgment, nothing that's important to it has been left out in length of time, breadth, or depth. Integral means you hold it all together as a whole rather than pieces. And meta-reflexive means you're not only reflexive about your presuppositions, you're reflexive about your reflexivity. You ask yourself rude questions about, are we even reflexive enough to do this well? And modernity requires critical consciousness and logic. It does not require reflexivity. So if you listen to our leaders, they will keep talking about critical thinking and facts. Almost none of them talk about being reflexive. None of them talk about being meta-reflexive. And all I'm saying is if you look for it, you find it in CACOR. I mean, it's one of the reasons I hang out with that CACOR is more meta-reflexive in a sense than it knows. And Canada is more meta-reflexive. It's a Canadian characteristic. If you look at the leaders who have helped define whole fields, if you look at Harold Innis in economics, he was the first man to integrate both communications and technology into economics. Harold Innis helped, so that he's a Canadian who helped change a whole field. Americans like to do stuff much more immediate. What am I going to do with it Monday morning? There's something about a cold Canadian winter and having to sit by the fire and sip scotch that makes us more reflective. And you Harold Innis, Marshall McLuhan, Northrop Frye, okay? When Northrop Frye was at his height, he was the third most quoted person in the world Academy, after only Jesus and Karl Marx. An extraordinary influence.
Hang on for a second.
And McLuhan was all about our consciousness.
Lauren, are you there?
Wilfred Cantwell Smith.
You go ahead.
So there's something Canadian about this work. And CACOR needs to offer it. I mean, the good folks in Rome, even the transformative project that the Club of Rome is doing now, does not understand what we're talking about today.
Okay, let's move on. Next one is Marilyn. Go ahead, please.
Hello, Ruben.
Oh, Marilyn.
I think that you were already beginning to answer the question that I had, and that was, where do we start in terms of bringing forth a new consciousness? Because I really think that without that, we're not going to really understand very much of what you were speaking about. And so you've talked about being reflective, and you've also used the word integral. And in my thinking, an integrative and reflective view or perspective often comes from the place that you live. And so that would mean that cultures then from different parts of the world might have different world views. How do we integrate all of those views into one consciousness so that we can think about what does collective consciousness look like?
That was what Jared Diamond was talking about.
Oh, Lord. Marilyn and I know each other, so I expect interesting and I mean a terribly important question. As I'm now thinking about it, the edge of my own thinking is that what will be common to us is not a common consciousness at the level we tend to think of that and use that language now, simply because of diversity of geography and human psyche and personality types and history. But where we will come together is at a meta level, that we will become conscious of the deep patterns by which we as human beings live on this planet and the patterns by which we understand the planet and ourselves. And so the thing that will become common is a meta understanding of how actually human beings and history and this earth work. And we don't have that now. Different forms of civilization are working with different meta understandings of reality. And my sense is that it's possible to move to a new meta understanding that is common across cultures. And in fact, you can see people with different backgrounds from literally different geographic locations, different cultural backgrounds, different ages, different religious and intellectual traditions, who are themselves open to conversations at a meta level. It's not yet common enough that it's even talked about much, but it is happening. And for me, that's part of the hope that there's actually a way out. And I absolutely agree that you don't learn to become meta-conscious before becoming conscious. In other words, and becoming conscious can be done, that depends in part on your personality type. If you're inherently reflective as I am, that's not virtue. That's just, talk to my kids, it's often a problem. A certain kind of it comes easily. Other people, as good educators know, learn to be reflective by physically moving their bodies in a different way, which is what Feldenkrais therapy is about. Or physically learning to manipulate objects in a different way, which is what architecture is about. So that there are lots of different ways of stimulating new consciousness. I think we're barely into the conversation of how do you stimulate metaconsciousness. As far as I know, that is not yet an established field. There's no publisher that claims to own that corner of our world.
But it's an enormous challenge, right?
It is an enormous challenge, and it's a challenge that we now know, in part because of the second law of thermodynamics and energy, that we know we cannot, this evolution can't be paced over centuries and millennia. That people argue about how many years have we got, and some say as little as 10, other people say as much as 200. But nobody who knows anything about what's going on is more than 200. And if you look at it as a bell curve, as a Gaussian curve, most folks are between 35 and 80. And so we have to be at this in a way that no culture in human history has ever had. Nobody has ever been challenged in the way those of us alive today in the world are now challenged. And I know that kind of statement is common and people laugh at our time in history. But I think in this regard, that's true. And we don't have one institution yet dedicated to this work.
So what can we do, Ruben, to become more engaged from a civic point of view in our own regions?
Well, you know, my fantasy, Marilyn, is that in spite of all that we are in Alberta, Alberta is going to be the first place on the planet to invest in the institutional infrastructure that is now required to do this work. Nobody on the planet is doing that. And that's one of the things we need to do.
So why do you say that?
Well, that's a different conversation. Let's let others in CACOR get
Yeah.
back.
Okay.
Could we move on? There's
Yeah.
David is next. David, you want to go ahead? Dorothy.
Well, I suppose that you've got me in because I made a comment about needing to empower women if we're going to control population. And, you know, I think we used to do a better job of that before essentially men took over the world. Go back to early Greek civilization, it was matriarchal.
Before the classical Greek.
Yeah, before the classical Greeks. Gene's in the background telling me that.
Well, and we're still having trouble seriously allowing for the experience and voice of women.
Yeah.
In the modern world. So I mean, I don't, the issue you're raising, that part of this is absolutely gender-based. I mean, it's one of the things in play here. I share that. I share it deeply. I mean, if I were advising Justin, I would say pass a law that if you want to change the governance in Canada, go to constituencies that have, each constituency has 2 representatives, and one of them has to be a woman. So everybody votes for a man and a woman in the same constituency. No constituency can vote for 2 men or 2 women.
Yeah, I think it's got to be even broader than that because
I'm not arguing it's sufficient. All I'm saying is I understand the point you're making.
yeah,
One
of the problems at the moment is we can always change our laws. We can change our constitution even, and unless everybody comes around to the idea that men and women do truly need to be equal, we are not going to get there. Women are going to continue to be suppressed.
No, well,
physical dominance.
It's not a story without some light. I'm not arguing that the darkness has been overcome, but my grandmother knew Nellie McClung, who was one of the famous 5 who took Canada to the Privy Council in England and won, that women were persons. So I've grown up with this all my life. And Marcel Massé, whom some of you may have been privileged to know, was the president at CETA in the early 80s when he put the top 300 executives through a program I designed to change the culture at CETA. And the most fundamental change that came out was the realization of the role of women in development. And CETA was the first development agency in the world to take seriously the role of women in development and to talk about that openly and to fund it accordingly and to change their practices. And yes, it's a long time, but remember in the past, we've had centuries and millennia to make these, and the conditions have been such that it has allowed us to do it. We now live in a world that we have, as the women say to men, time's up. Time's up, guys. And so we need a new time's up movement in which we men are speaking up with women and our millennials and young people and say openly to ourselves and our culture, time's up. We've had enough of this. We need something else.
Okay, let's move on to the next one. Bill Tyson, you're next. You're muted.
What Sasha had said, that the only way to reduce population is to show people that it's in their best interest to do so. And that is a question of making it clear that they can have more in life if they have fewer kids.
Women figured this out. The thing that CETA discovered in the 80s, in addition to women's consciousness, which by the 1980s, Ms. Magazine had been around for a decade, but in addition to that, they absolutely understood the correlation between the education of young women and the fall in the birth rate. And you only get education of young women if you respect them enough, if you see women as persons who actually have a life of their own and that they're worth educating. And so that a reperception of the reality of women was at the heart of that. And as I've said, I was there and I'm happy to be part of it. If it weren't for Marcel Massé, it wouldn't have happened. He was an extraordinary leader.
Okay, let's move on. Zach, you're next.
Oh, I passed. I had nothing to add but a wisecrack.
Okay, John, Leg, you're on.
Thank you, Art. Ruben, you said at one point that the living, you didn't say it exactly in these words, but you said that the world will be green for 1 billion years. Well, I'm not sure about that because as we go down the road to global warming, you get a number of people who remind us that geoengineering is a possibility. You throw up a bunch of dark powder and you can cut out quite a bit of the sun's rays. And I'm sure that more ambitious people are already experimenting with this. What's his name? Gwynne Dyer. He wrote a book called Climate Wars about 12 years ago, and we know that area, geoengineering. So we all know a little bit about science, and we know that man's, or how should I say, humankind's ability to screw things up is almost unlimited. And so when you say green, well, I suppose you could say, well, after a nuclear devastation, there are cockroaches running around. And well, that's a sign of life. And if you want to be a little bit over-promising, you could say, well, that's green because that's life. Well, sorry, I'm not sure that green for 1 billion years is what we can really think of. Do you have any, how should I say, illumination or at least amplification of what you said when you did talk about green for 1 billion years?
What I meant to say, it maps onto your cockroach and other forms of life, including vegetation, is that there, as I understand what we think we know now, and all of this, of course, is subject to, because if I am subject to the very things I say we as a species are subject to, it means our little islands of knowledge float on vast seas of ignorance. But as I understand things now, we do have the capacity to destroy the conditions on the planet that are fit for human life and fit for most of the species that we hold dear and are in love with. 2 days ago, there was a young 2-year-old black bear cub on our front lawn because I live in the Rocky Mountains of Alberta. And Heather and I rejoice when we see bears on our front lawn. We don't want them to become habituated. We're very careful, but we're always happy to see them wander by. So that, yes, we can destroy the conditions for human life and black bears and polar bears and virtually everything we think of. But life itself is virulent on this planet. And until the sun expands enough to do us in, there will be life here. And even if it took 100 million years, that's only 1/10 of a billion. And 1 billion years from now, nobody's arguing that what we know about the sun, that it will have exhausted its fuel enough to threaten the Earth. And people are arguing about, is it 1 billion or 3 billion? That's way beyond my carrying capacity. So what I mean by the world will be green is we have done ourselves in and the world as we know it. And there is no chance The path we're on is literally a path to death of the world as we know it.
Okay, John, any comeback?
No, thank you. Thank you very much, Ruben. I'm glad you have, how should I say, the same lack of faith in humans' wisdom as we see it now.
I have a comeback. I'm sorry. I have a comeback.
Well,
Here's that.
Is that Zach? It sounds like Zach.
is that Zach? Was that you, Zach?
Yep.
Go ahead.
My comeback is, my point was actually rather different. At current trends, we're going to push the Earth into a different phase, a Venus-like state. That's a planet Venus. And that would last for billions of years, and there's no life there of any form. That's what I meant by not green. Billions of years. I'm sorry, guys. I'm not. I'm in exactly the opposite corner. Cheers. Bye.
And that's that, as far as we know, is one of the adjacent possibles, to use Stuart Kaufman's phrase.
Sorry, what? I didn't.
It's an adjacent possible. It's that we don't know enough yet to decide whether we face a Venus-like future or we face a long future with life until the Earth, until the sun supernovas.
I'm sorry, I think you're optimistic. I think that's an adjacent probable.
Okay, let's move on, because we got Gabriella waiting here patiently. And could you go ahead, Gabriella?
Hi, Ruben. Finally. Okay, I guess I'm just going back just briefly on what David mentioned about the role of women. And you were talking about that as well. You elaborated a little bit. My concern is, I'm trying to make a connection with what you were talking about before, the cultures and religion, and how can we actually include women in the future if we're not changing the cultures, like some of the native cultures of some of the religions.
Well, we are. I meant to be heard as saying modern culture as we now know it is on a path to death. Therefore, we need to adapt modern culture as an adaptable species in ways that by the time we're finished, or our grandchildren or great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren are finished, it will be unrecognizable. And you probably know, Gabriella, that if you talk to indigenous people about their religion, they will say, in our language, we have no word for that. If you talk to them about their art, they will say, no, we don't do art. Art is something you modern people do, that you put things in pigeonholes. In an integral sense of life, there is no such thing as a separate religion or separate art or a separate economy. There is life and living life and roles to be played and sensibilities that different sensibilities depending on the situation you're in and even how you read that situation. So that what I am calling for and what Bill Reese is calling for is a fundamental transformation to literally transcend modernity. We have to move beyond it into something that at this point we can barely glimpse. That if you think of Western mythology, it's like the Hebrew people being in Egypt, and they know they've been there 500 years, and they know they're slaves, and they know if they stay, the only future they face is as slaves. And Moses promises them a more promising future, and they say, where? And he says, it's out there. It's kind of northeast. And he says, what else do you know about it? And they say, it'll be a land flowing with milk and honey. And they say, what else do you know about it? And he says, nothing. And he says, how do we get there? And he basically says, we who are living will have to go out into the wilderness and die there. And it will be our grandchildren who move into the new world.
Well, what I can see right now is an increase in the trust in religion more as a savior. I see that as a feed I get from people. Now I'm not talking about here, but necessarily in Canada. But say if you take us, I hear from Brazil or Eastern Europe and so on. It's incredible how much trust they give to religion because they lost trust in other in science or everything else.
And as we know about us, that we do demand meaning of some kind or other. And therefore we will create sources of meaning and authorities that give us that meaning. That I'm speaking as a species here. And therefore, as modernity continues to disintegrate, you can expect people, I expect people will clump into, and some of these will be very large clumps. Some of them will go to religion, some will go to art, some will go to the university and say the universities will save us, some will go to governments, some will go to the business world. In other words, we will initially go to the fragments we moderns already talk of. And I expect that to be a fundamental dynamic over the next 30 years, regardless of what we do. Because as I see it, there's not a darn thing we can do to stop the disintegration of modernity. We already know too much to believe in it. But on the way down, since we don't know we're modern and don't know those dynamics,
I'm just going to tell
Art
that I have to leave.
Minor gods. Yep, it's time.
Yeah, I have tried to put everybody's video back up and unmute everyone. There's still some people who have control of their own mute and they're not on. Rather than go until we're all exhausted, I think we're getting pretty close to that anyway. At this point, I'm going to stop the recording and